I want to welcome Suzanne Gross and thank her for speaking. I'm leaving. I have a funeral to go to at 1 o'clock. And so we have board members here, Dawn and Pauline and Paula, who's doing the taping, have offered to help clean up at the end. So, and Dawn will thank our guest and give you a little gift from us, which is a 2016 multi-day calendar, only 2 months, Dawn.
Right.
So thank you again, and I will just sit here for a few minutes, but when I leave, I'm leaving. Goodbye. Oh, and I'll get chairs too.
Okay. So should I introduce myself? Is that the first thing?
Yes, please.
So I'm Suzanne Gross, and I am the manager of strategic initiatives at the Edmonton Mennonite Centre for Newcomers.
The
But-
manager of what?
Strategic initiatives.
Okay.
It's a mouthful and it's a little bit fuzzy, but basically when there are new opportunities that come our way, I help vet them and make them happen. But today, so the Mennonite Centre for Newcomers has been around for 35 years and was a project of the Mennonite churches, which is why Mennonite is still in the name. But we have grown from a staff of 1.5 to 170, and only 2 of us are Mennonite. So we are multi-faith and multi-everything. I don't know if we have the Lions Club represented, but we might. So today I'm actually not speaking from that hat. I'm one of the 2 Mennonites, and so I'm going to speak from my tradition. And because I work in an immigrant serving agency, I think I have some insights into why we do this work. And it's connected to our history, so I'd like to start there, if that's okay. Can everybody hear me? Mm-hmm. All right.
Loud and clear.
Okay. So the Mennonite Church goes back to the Radical Reformation, when Martin Luther set things in motion in 1517 with his 95 Theses. It opened up dialogue around what it means to be the church. And there were a bunch of guys, I guess, in Zurich, Switzerland, who felt like the reformers weren't being radical enough. So they were saying, so we're keeping infant baptism and we're keeping fighting wars, and both of those are in opposition to the biblical mandate of, they felt like believers' baptism was where things should be. It should be a voluntary commitment to a way of life, and they also believed that fighting was against the ethic of love and that Jesus preached. And so they started getting in trouble. So the first baptism, adult baptism, happened in 1525. And by 1527, persecution started. So those guys started something and people started joining, and there was the peasants. The peasants were struggling with kind of having some dignity, and so they kind of joined in this venture too. And then there was some splits, and some of you might know about the Munsterites who had a bit of a different vision of building the kingdom of God. But these quiet, peaceful Anabaptists continued to grow, and were persecuted. So they were drowned, they were burned at the stake, and a parallel group started in Holland. Because there was communication, right, through the printing press. That was kind of a new thing. And so a guy named Menno Simons, who was a Catholic priest, started reading about people being killed for their faith, so he got curious. And so he learned more, and he joined. And he was clever. He didn't get killed, and so he was able to write. So people started associating this movement with Menno, and therefore Mennonites. So, persecution, this movement grew in spite of persecution, but it did wear people down. And so pathways out of persecution evolved. So the people in Switzerland either went up into the mountains where they were given a place to, the poor land to farm, as long as they didn't interact with the villagers. So that, my ancestry is that. My mother is a Swiss Mennonite, and my grandfather would have been born in one of these villages, and then at a certain point they were obviously welcomed into regular society, but actually mid-19th century is when that finally opened up. So there were years and years where they were isolated in these little villages. Some of them went to South Germany, and where they were kind of given respite, and then they went to Pennsylvania, and then Ontario. So that's that migration. So Switzerland, southern Germany, Pennsylvania, Ontario, and then from Pennsylvania to Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Kansas, Iowa. That's kind of how that pattern worked. So those would have been more seeking religious freedom. Was the Pennsylvania, the holy experiment of William Penn. They went to Ontario. Some of them went to Ontario because they had promised allegiance to King George, and they took their promises very seriously, and so they went to Ontario during the Revolution. And the other group in Holland also suffered persecution, but they ended up going to Prussia, where they were welcomed, and the agreement was, you'll contribute to, they were good water people, right? They were water architects, being Dutch, and the Prussians needed some of that, so they brought them in, with the condition that they not have to fight wars. And that lasted for a couple generations, but then the leadership changed, and they instituted a law where if you were above a certain height, you had to fight in the wars. And these tall Dutch guys fit that bill, so they up and moved, and they joined Catherine the Great invited them to Ukraine. And so a lot of German people went there, not just the Mennonites, but they had these colonies, and they lived there for 100 years. So I'll just give you a framework so that my ancestry from southern Germany, so my mother's Swiss, my father's Swiss Mennonite, came in 1698 already. That's when that all started happening. The Russian Mennonites were in Ukraine, we call them Russian Mennonites, but they were really in Ukraine, for about 100 years. And in 1870, 1880, a lot of them came to Western Canada and Kansas and Nebraska as economic migrants. But in 1920, everything fell apart in that part of the world. And this is, I think, where our interest in refugees probably started. I mean, we were refugees. We were persecuted. We've been a persecuted people. We understand and identify with being marginalized. But it was really the Russian Mennonite experience that gave us firsthand experience with the suffering that comes with being put in a situation where you want to flee. So because of the war often produces famine. That's kind of a known thing, and that's what happened. So there was communication between the Russian Mennonites and the rest of the Mennonite world in North America and Europe, and the call for help was loud and clear. We are dying. And so Mennonite Central Committee was born. And so Mennonites are known for they're always splitting, right? Because we don't have a pope to tell us how to think. And so we're always fighting over this and that, and then we have different groups. But the adult baptism and the peace dance is what holds us together. And when this call came, everybody was willing to put aside all those differences and create this central committee. So all the different kinds of Mennonites came together. And Goshen College, which is a little Mennonite liberal arts college in northern Indiana, it's my alma mater, at that point was very proactive. They had connections in Istanbul, and so there was a natural launching pad from there to bring in things to support this famine. And apparently, Saskatchewan farmers played a huge role in this. So the Central Committee was in northern Indiana, or Chicago, I think. It started in Chicago, but it was in that part of North America. But then, of course, they needed stuff to take, and it was Saskatchewan farmers, Mennonite farmers, that answered that call. And so on one, I looked this up a little bit. So the peak was 40,000 food servings during August in 1922. So kitchens provided 25,000 people a day with rations, but the peak was 40,000. So that's an incredible effort.
Yes.
And that was obviously the Band-Aid. So the longer term solution was to send, and if you have farming background, you might know what this means. They sent tractors. Now I can't, 50 Fordson tractors and plow combinations. Does that make any sense? They were sent to Mennonite villages to replace the horses that had been stolen and confiscated during the war. So that relief effort cost $1.2 million back in 1922.
And where was this equipment sent to?
To the colonies in Ukraine.
Oh, okay.
But unfortunately, that was a short-term solution because things got worse and worse. And so those people that, the interesting thing is, I'm from this Swiss Mennonite background that came in 1698. We've had generations and generations of having settled here and having been integrated. I go to a church where people still know that they're alive because of this famine relief. They know that. They're either first or second or third, well, probably second or third generation by now, but that memory and that story is still very alive in their heads. But they became refugees. So they also have stories of getting on that train, holding their breath that nothing would happen as they crossed over into Western Europe and then up into Holland, where Mennonite Central Committee helped bring them over to Canada, Western Canada and the US. And then that happened again after World War II. Again, these Mennonites were brought over as refugees. So that's where some of that started happening. Now, another thing that I think impacted Mennonite Central Committee was the Vietnam War. So during the Vietnam War, MCC was in Vietnam doing medical and agricultural work to help that situation. And my aunt and uncle, my uncle was a medical doctor, my aunt a nurse, spent probably 6 years in Vietnam until 1968. And so that's an important part of the story for Edmonton, because in the late 1970s, we all know that Saigon fell and people started getting into boats, and just like very recently, everybody's heart went out to these people, and the Canadian government said we will resettle so many, and some people said we can do more than that. And Mennonite Central Committee out of Winnipeg was one of the big players that set up the private sponsorship stream that Canada has to this day. And Canada is, I think, one of the only countries that offers that program to citizens. And so that's when this whole idea of privately sponsored refugees started. And in Edmonton, there was a lot of churches, a lot of church groups were playing their part, doing their part in bringing people over. And so there was a living room conversation, maybe about this big, I don't know, I wasn't here, where people said, we got to do something to settle them. There's not enough in Edmonton to make sure that's, it's great that we're bringing people here, but then what?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
What's the next step? And so there was a woman in the group named Anne Falk, who had been a Mennonite Central Committee relief worker in Vietnam as a nurse on furlough for that year. She was planning to go back. She never did go back. But she was perfect for that. So they hired 1.5 staff, plus a whole bunch of volunteers, obviously, to do the settlement and connect people to employment. This was when there were no liability issues, so that everybody would pile in a car, forget seatbelts, and just go to a factory or whatever, a startup place, and people
What
would
about
just hire
housing?
them on the spot. I don't know if housing was an issue back in 1970, 79 to 82. I actually don't know.
Okay.
But I do know that back then, people opened up their homes.
Oh, all right.
So the
Yes,
Vietnamese
yes,
would come and actually live in people's homes for a while.
Yes.
That was a lot easier to do than today, too. So anyway, Anne Falk played a huge role in allowing this new project to get off the ground. And apparently, she passed away in 1997. I never got to meet her. I came to Canada in 1999. but apparently she was a very energetic settlement worker and very passionate about making sure people understood systems. And apparently she would walk into ESL classrooms and talk about frostbite and make sure these people did the right things to avoid weather-related issues and things like that. She was a nurse. That's right. So where are we in our story? So that was kind of how it started. I think it started as a project just to settle these Vietnamese, Laotian, and Cambodian people, but pretty soon Salvadorans were coming, and Ethiopians, and Chileans, and other African groups.
Serbians.
And then Serbians. So these waves kept coming, and it was pretty clear that having an ongoing agency with programming was really critical. So, and that outgrew our little, we have a tiny, actually, Mennonite community here, if you think about it. And so it became a community agency in 1983. So since then, it's been a community agency that has accessed all levels of government funding. And like I said, we've grown to a staff of 170. We still do ESL, employment and settlement. And from the settlement, so settlement is what you need to do to get on your feet, basically.
Yes.
So navigating the health system, navigating the school system, signing up for child tax benefit, making sure your documents are all current, understanding how to keep your documents, all that sort of thing. But we noticed a few areas of trouble, I guess. One was stay-at-home moms with young children. They were isolated. They were scared to go out on their own. They didn't have much English, some of them. They were scared to use the buses. Sometimes they had a lot of children. And so we started a parenting and literacy program. We have an agency van. We pick them up at the beginning until they have more confidence to go on their own. And so that's a settlement program that plays the role of making sure people aren't isolated. They all want their children to flourish and grow and play together. So they're not isolating their children because they want to isolate their children. They're very, very happy when their children have a chance to play with other kids and learn English and start developing the skills for school. So we have field trips into the schools and the libraries. And so that's an example of a settlement program that has grown out of our settlement work. Another one is the Settlement in Schools program. So there, the families were telling us things like, my child is in a special behavioral class and I don't know what happened. So they signed something they didn't understand. The schools put children who had never been in school before into a behavioral class after 2 weeks. This was years ago. They don't do that anymore. But we saw that as an opportunity to start working with the schools to help them understand the immigrant experience and the pre-migration experience of refugees especially. And so schools don't do that at all. They call us in to help broker understanding, and sometimes we play a social emotional role for kids that are struggling at the beginning of their school experience. And the other thing they told us was some of them can't read or write in their first language, and so they're struggling with English and they can't help with homework, and so could you start a homework club because we want our children to succeed. So we've done that sort of thing. Okay. The most recent chapter in our story that has to do with refugees includes the work of Donna Entz. So some of you don't know Donna, right? So Donna Entz, she paved the way for the Mennonite element in Edmonton to play a really hospitable role in welcoming the Syrian refugees, who are mostly Muslim, but not all. I've met Druze, I've met Assyrians, I've met Syrian Orthodox, I've met secular Syrians, and then the Sunni Muslim Syrians. So Donna was hired by Mennonite Church Alberta initially to do some kind of church planting work in North Edmonton. But those of you who heard Donna would know that she didn't feel real comfortable with some of the baggage that goes along with that thinking. So instead of planting churches, she built relationships and became a bridge builder and created all these dialogues and things like that to try to get groups to understand and respect and value each other's faiths. And if Donna hadn't done that, I don't think we would have been in a position that we were when the Syrian war broke out. So we have a choir at the Mennonite Centre. That's another outgrowth of some of our programming. We thought we would help people learn English through folk songs. Sometimes if you have a different avenue to learning, it just amplifies that learning. But very soon we started learning songs from each other. And so we sing in many, many languages. I think 16 is what I counted last. All songs that we've learned from each other. And one woman named Grada, Ghada, I'm pretty close there, Grada, was in the choir and had taught us some Iraqi folk songs. She's Syrian, Palestinian Syrian. But, and she just came all upset one day. She said, there was so much hope for this Syrian spring, to get freedom. And it's all falling apart. And we were singing a song from South Africa called "Oh Freedom," and we had to sing that for her that day, just because she was so thirsting for something to hang on to in this thing that was falling apart. And it got worse and worse, and she had relatives who were suffering, and she said, what can we do? And we couldn't do anything, because they were all in Syria. But at a point where it got so bad that people had to flee Syria, then they were true refugees. Because to be a refugee, you have to be outside of your country for reasons of persecution or political upheaval or whatever. And so it was at that point that Mennonite Central Committee, who's had this long experience working with private groups to sponsor families, contacted the government and said, you're not, this is the Harper government, so you're not doing anything for Syrians. And they said, no, we can't, because we don't have any names, because they didn't have anybody on the ground in the embassies surrounding Syria to be able to provide names of refugees. They had completely cut back on that part of their immigration portfolio. And so, because of Donna knew all these Syrians through her connections, we said, well, we got names. We have names. We have people in Edmonton who have relatives there who are registered with the UN and who are Syrian refugees. So already in November of 2014, I think those first applications went in, and they were processed by March 2015. That's when the first family came. Now, just to give you a context, we call them sponsorship agreement holders. So Mennonite Central Committee is one, the Catholic Archdiocese is one, the Anglicans have theirs, the United Church has theirs. And all of these had gone dormant because it was taking 3 years at least to process anything. So people, you lose, if you're joining this effort, then you have to wait 3 years. You think too many things can change in 3 years, I guess. So if you think about it, from November to March, that's pretty amazing. So, and then they started coming a couple of months between March and November. And then, of course, after the election, everything changed, the commitment changed, and now it's just fast. I mean, we hired somebody named Mohammed, who is now our connector, and he was at the airport Sunday night welcoming 5 families. That was unusual. Usually it's 1 or 2, but 5 families on Sunday night came through the privately sponsored stream. And those are no longer only with Mennonite Central Committee. Now all those other groups are back in gear, and it's a very exciting time to see the community come together that way. All right. So I'm speaking. I'm not reading from my notes, but I will say.
Better this way.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll just conclude here. I want to share with you one of my favorite Bible verses, and that's Hebrews 13:2. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. And I have to say that all the Syrians I've gotten to know so far have blessed me, and so that's my experience with this latest chapter.
Suzanne, that was
Hebrews 13, verse 2.
13:2. Thank
Yeah.
you.
So just to summarize, I think the Mennonite history of persecution and marginalization has impacted our desire to reach out. The conviction of peacemaking has always allowed us to look beyond political agendas. We're community-minded with an emphasis of helping each other, which is extended beyond ourselves. So the Mennonite Central Committee story started with helping our own, but very quickly moved beyond helping our own. The stories and activities of MCC and another agency called Mennonite Disaster Service, which is also an arm of the Mennonite Church, where, again, people put aside their theological differences and help build a house. And so we're often involved when we were helping high-level people rebuild, for example. New Orleans, we've been there for years. The New York one is another one we've been involved with. And I would say that our interest and desire is all rooted in the teachings of Jesus when it comes to service to others, and to feeding the hungry and the thirsty, and loving our enemies, and remembering the prisoners, and reaching out to the marginalized, including and honoring the foreigners, and ultimately showing our allegiance to God and to building humanity, not an allegiance to the agenda of the nation state. That's been very, very powerful in my upbringing. There you go.
Suzanne, where do you get the money for all this work?
So are you talking about Mennonite Central Committee or Edmonton Mennonite Centre for Newcomers?
Let's talk Edmonton for refugee settlement.
Okay, well, like I said, the Mennonite Centre for Newcomers is 80% government funded. But in the Syrian crisis, somehow we got the ear of the media, and after the Paris attacks, there was so much opposition to the really ugly things that were being said. People just started calling us and wanting to donate, and so we started a Syrian refugee fund, and that is huge. Like, we haven't had that sort of donation response for things because it hasn't been media covered quite as intensely.
How much?
I think we're up to 175,000. Just in 3 weeks or so. And one guy called us. He said, "I'm a business guy. I'm not going to have any energy or time to settle anybody, but I can make money. I can find 30 other businesses, and we can get 30. It costs about 30,000 to settle a family of 4 or 5. So he did it. He worked with us, and so we have this pot of money sitting there, and applications in. So we have the families. They're through local families, so that'll make the settlement part easy, and they can lean on EMCN. But 80% is government funded for all the settlement. And I have to say, in spite of conservative governments coming through, CIC, which is now called IRCC, has been so, we're the envy of the world when it comes to funding for settlement and language programs. So the language instruction for newcomers to Canada is a federally funded program. It's free. And if you come as a refugee, you have that year where you're being subsidized, either privately or by the government, so you can take full-time link. It's not enough. You need more than 1 year. It takes 7 years to really learn a language well. But you can certainly start learning and get that first job, and then keep that up. And so it's the federal government is very, very good at funding the settlement needs of newcomers. It's wonderful.
When the Vietnamese people first came to Edmonton, I was working for the federal government in the New Horizons program, and one of the staff of Mennonite Centre contacted me to see if I could work with the seniors of the Vietnamese community.
Yeah.
They were on 109th Street and 107th Avenue at the time. And one of the things we funded was English language for seniors,
Yeah.
because the government would give them 6 months English language
At that
training
point. Oh,
at
okay.
that point, and then they were cut off. If you weren't a senior, if you were younger and could be in business or something, then you could get more English training. But I was able to get them grants to do the continuing English language training for seniors, and then a group of them formed a Vietnamese group to do a magazine, which was all in Vietnamese.
I think it still exists, doesn't it? With Tan Nguyen?
Yes, with
Yeah,
Tang.
yeah.
He was my contact there.
Yeah.
And that magazine, was, as I say, was all Vietnamese except when they asked me to write something on behalf of the government. And then there was one English.
Right, article.
But the story of what's happening with the Syrian people coming into Edmonton is a gradual growth out of that and many other experiences people in the churches have had. And I haven't been personally involved, but I'm told that the 7 churches in Sherwood Park have got together and worked to bring in a family of 20. And they had a house all lined up and had painted it and so on, and were all ready to bring them in. And when they discovered there were 20 in the family, they had to find another house. And the rent went up
Of
from
course.
2,000 to 4,000 and so on. And they're working together in amazing ways as 7 different churches.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you know Don Coots from Riverbend United, and they had been working with their community to prepare to bring in Syrian refugees. And I don't know whether it was Friday or Saturday, he got a message saying that this family of, I think it was 16, would be arriving at 11:05 Sunday morning. So they immediately swung into action to try and find somebody in the congregation who had a vehicle to bring all these people from the airport into the church. Couldn't find anybody, so he finally phoned a fellow who ran a limousine business. And he said, we need a limousine to be at the airport at 11 tomorrow morning in order to bring in our Syrian refugees. And he said there was silence at the other end. And the fellow finally said, well, I'll be there with 2 limousines, one for them and one for their luggage. And he said, I'm Syrian, so I can talk to them when they arrive.
Oh, talk about the stars aligning, eh?
That's a wonderful story.
And
Oh, isn't
there's so many different stories.
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
And I don't take any credit for them.
But we should collect them.
Leaping off that, if one isn't in a faith community or anything, what, and certainly can't afford to sponsor a family, what does one do?
Well, I'll just correct that. There are many groups that are not faith community connected,
Okay.
who have like 30 people members, and they've all chipped in and are part
Oh,
of
so
the
they've
group.
set themselves
Yeah.
up as a group.
I know
Okay.
one group of 30 that has done that.
Yeah.
And individuals can contribute.
Yeah.
If I could just make a comment, I'm in that boat right now. I put an ad in our local newspaper, and I said, this is when I'm holding a meeting. If you're interested, come and help me. Now, the fact, there were 17 people that showed up, and we've only had the one meeting. The next one's on the 23rd of February. I happen to be connected with St. Albert United Church, but we are not, my small group and I are not in the position yet of presenting a proposal to our church council. So I'm operating as an individual at the moment.
Right.
I just put an
Yeah.
ad in the paper.
Yeah, cool. I mean, you can do a group of 5. That's a group of 5 working directly with the government. You can do a community-based group, or you can do it through these sponsorship agreement holders. There are a bunch of different avenues.
I heard, I'm not sure if it's going through, but High Level Diner apparently.
They did? That's the group that has 30. Yeah, exactly. That's the example that I'm talking about.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. And a bunch of lawyers got together and they're sponsoring 14 families in Ellerslie. I'm glad there are 14 of them in Ellerslie. That's a little remote.
Oh, yeah, they were on the radio, they were on CBC.
Yeah, yeah. But beyond that, I mean, what else can we do? One of the things that happened was people wanted to donate things. And so we've been working with the Edmonton, the group that helped with Slave Lake, Edmonton Relief Agency, Edmonton Crisis Relief. Anyway, they're downtown at the corner of 104 Avenue and 102 Street, I think. And they've been working with us to process all these donations and work with a voucher system so that families have access to winter coats. And people were so generous. We got brand new stuff, brand new winter coats, and then some of the riffraff too. People donated that as well. But we're able to sort all that through. But we're always looking for people to help sort. Like, when you have that kind of effort, there are a bunch of different jobs that are associated with handling the donations. So that's a place that we're always looking for support.
Where's your center located?
Our center?
Yeah.
We're on just by the Coliseum, just south of 118th Avenue on 82nd Street. But this Edmonton, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name.
Is that Peacock?
Yes, the Peacock Boutique.
Right, oh, so that's where they do the sorting?
Yeah, downstairs.
Right.
They have piles of stuff.
I think that's
we've
on
had-
about 103rd and 103rd or something.
Right, it's at the corner of 104th though, 104th
Right, yeah.
and 103rd, yeah.
Downtown.
Yeah,
Mhm.
near the Mercer building.
Yeah, I'll try to get the name. I mean, if you would like
Emergency
to help,
relief
emergency relief
Emergency Relief Service.
services, that's what it is. So if you Googled that, and called Heather would welcome support for
Is
sorting.
that the one that started after the tornado?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think I heard that, yeah.
And
So they were there for fires, but,
104th Street and 102nd Avenue.
it's either 102nd or 103rd.
and then
Yeah, okay.
these language programs, what's the qualification for someone to contribute to that? To teach?
Well, you can volunteer.
That's what
Oh, you just have to speak English well. Get along well with people. I think you qualify.
I like to drink tea.
Yeah.
We have an agency, the United Church Intercultural Committee started, and they're asking for volunteers from the churches to support this program, and they say there's two kinds of support. There's one that requires formal training, and that requires formal lessons that go with the group. The other group is the volunteer group, and they meet with 5 or 6 people just to talk, to get them to hear the sound of the language and to straighten out sometimes the pronunciation and give meaning to the words. So there's two kinds of
That's right.
volunteers, I think, that make this a very exciting program.
Yeah.
One of them is presently working from Knox United Church across the street.
Yeah. Well, and I just want to, I'm glad you reminded me about the seniors, because I was talking about the different groups that struggle with settlement, and the seniors we identified a long time ago as a group that needs special programming. So at SAGE, we work with SAGE to offer a pretty cool ESL, community ESL program. We actually call it EAL, because many people have more than one language. English is an additional language. It's honoring the rich linguistic talents that people come with.
English as a,
Additional language.
not also, it's additional.
It's a technical term now, I think, that they're using.
Yeah, EAL. And so anyway, so the Syrians haven't joined that. I mean, the other change is, so there used to be a cap on the number of hours that you could take this federal program, but when the Harper government changed the requirements for citizenship and made the test really hard, I'm not sure any of you would pass it the first time without studying. I was lucky. I became a citizen in 2007. I got the easy test. But a couple of years later, I mean, I think in 2009 it changed. And plus, you have to prove a certain language level to even qualify to become a citizen. Well, then people had to come back into the system to get that level, and so they had to remove the hour limit. But you can imagine it also flooded the program, and so we actually just last year doubled our part-time program because we had 400 people on the waiting list. Because all these other people came back into the program so that they could become citizens. So I guess the good news is now people can take that program as long as they need to before they become a citizen, but it does make kind of planning a little bit harder.
I have a question. With the UESL, is that just for refugees or is it also for
Skilled immigrants.
temporary foreign workers who are looking for citizenship?
It's for permanent residents. So our funding supports our work to support permanent residents or people who have been accepted as convention refugees. So if they came and made their claim as a refugee in Canada, had their hearing, and they were accepted as a convention refugee, then they qualify for our programming. And permanent residents, and we do have a lot of programs for citizens. Temporary foreign workers were left out on their own. It was a terrible program from our point of view.
Yes, I agree.
And so I was very glad. I mean, we were able in our, so we offer psychological services for people who've been through trauma. And because of our various streams of funding, we were able to support them in counseling. And our parenting and literacy program is also all provincially funded, and so there was no status question about that either, because we're just trying to make sure families are healthy. And but in general, the setup was ignored and left the temporary foreign workers.
So there's really no place
No,
they can
I
go,
can get you the right
you know, to get
address down
access
if you want.
to ESL that would sort
They have to
of
pay for
target.
it. They could pay for it.
They could pay for it?
They could pay for it.
Through,
So we had a program where we worked with employers, and either the employer paid for it, but I'm pretty sure we had some programs for them that they had to pay for it. Minimal, but still, just enough to cover.
and that would help target that test, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Oh, well, no, you have to be a permanent resident for like 4 or 5 years now before you can become a citizen. So if you're a temporary foreign worker, you have to become a permanent resident. Only then can you start counting years towards your citizenship. So, yeah. I mean, that would get you started, but it's certainly...
Suzanne, could you say more about the meaning of the Geneva Conventions in this context?
You know what, I'm not sure I'm the expert. I have heard that they're reconsidering some of the definitions, right? I heard that in the news, that they're, as a result of this Syrian thing, in Europe, they're going to be reconsidering the definition of a UN refugee. I mean, basically, you have to be out of your country, and a political or from a war situation, so scared for your safety. So it's safety concerns, or you're a politically ostracized. And I think sexual orientation is another one. And so those are reasons that allow you to claim UN refugee status, but you have to be outside of your country.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
But that's all I can say. I'm not the expert on this.
And a different question, but what is the link or the relationship between the your Mennonite, Edmonton Mennonite Centre and Catholic Social Services in Edmonton?
Well, we're both funded by IRCC. We're working together right now. They're the ones that are settling the government-assisted refugees, and so every 2 weeks we go into the hotel and kind of give them a night out. We did that just Friday. It was wonderful. They were dancing, and they take over the party usually because that's how they are. It was wonderful to see them feeling at home here, actually. So we support that way. We're involved in a partnership in Millwoods called the Welcome Centre for Immigrants. In general, Catholic Social Services does settlement. They don't do any employment. The Mennonite Centre does employment. But we also do some settlement. And then we have these settlement programs that they might not have. And we do a lot with psychological counseling. That's been around 25 years. We were UN funded for a long time to develop the Edmonton Centre for Survivors of Torture and Trauma. So we were a big player kind of setting the bar for appropriate psychological supports for victims of war trauma, which is different than other sorts of trauma.
Do you work with, say, the Indo-Women's Society or Edmonton Immigrant Services or some of
Well,
those?
Indo-Canadian Women's is the third partner in this Mill Woods venture. So because a large population there is from that part of the world, they have cultural expertise that adds to the mix. So we work closely with them in that project. ISA, Edmonton
Immigrants, yeah.
We interface with them. I mean, they have their program in the schools, and we work alongside with them in some schools, but try not to duplicate work. They have a little bit of a different focus in the schools. It's more of a whole family referral settlement service, whereas we actually are there with the youth, and they do some, they're at Edith Rogers doing some after-school programming as well. So we just make sure, I mean, there's way more work than all of us have, right? So we just make sure we're not duplicating.
Yeah, I think there's a few people who haven't had a chance to ask a question yet, so.
Right.
Anybody?
I would like to bring up something. I'm not a refugee, but I came December 1st, 67 with 3 little girls, the oldest 4 years old, and a husband. And I have never in my life been so lonely. I couldn't talk to anybody. I didn't know what was going on. I had to go to the doctor. I didn't know how to take the bus. And I was certainly not going to dress like those silly people with the toga scarf around. So I just marched along, and sure enough, frostbite on the ears and all of that. But it was so hard, really, really hard. And what you're doing, not necessarily with the clothes and all that, you're doing a fantastic job, because you really need somebody you can talk to in the beginning.
Well, and we recognize that plays a huge role in your sense of belonging.
Oh, yeah.
And for the children too. So we were called. So some schools welcome us more than others, right? Some schools think they can do it on their own. But this one school had a bunch of. It was an elementary school, 6 kids or so, that were just not very happy in school, and they were doing everything they could, and it didn't seem to be working. So, and I think they were from Africa somewhere. I'm saying that generally. I know Africa's big, but. So we sent Joseph, who's South Sudanese, one of our brokers, and he met with them and started engaging with them, and just his presence in the school made them feel like they belonged more. And they actually articulated that. They said, it's fun coming to school now. And he only went once a week, right? But that's all it took.
Oh, yeah.
It doesn't take much, right? It really doesn't take much. But that's why we started the choir. Some people find a place to belong there. So we try to create places where they belong. And that Friday night thing that we did with the Syrians, that was the goal, right? For them to claim some ownership in their experience. This was the second time we did it. The first time, I'd heard that they liked poetry, and I didn't know what that meant, if they liked reading poetry or writing poetry. Well, it turns out they like writing poetry. So they like doing things in rhyme. And a woman wrote 2 spontaneous poems that night, and I thought, what a brilliant way to engage with your present, right?
Yes.
Your present experience is to start having poems that reflect some of that. So yes, having a feeling of belonging is huge, and that offsets the loneliness. Yeah.
But it was funny, in the springtime, the 2 oldest could go outside to play, and they came right back. We don't understand what they're saying up there. That's fine, that's fine. I swear, a week later, they were fluent in English.
Yeah. The kids do learn faster, that's
Oh,
right.
yeah, and they're not afraid of making mistakes.
Yes,
As an adult,
yes.
you know, I better do it right and all of that.
Any other questions?
This is not a question, it's a comment really, but looking back on the history, refugee system has involved a great many churches working together.
Yes.
Now, that didn't happen in another 2 or 3 generations because the United Church, particularly because it was a Canadian church founded by the Parliament of Canada, they assumed that the immigrants would join their church. Well, they discovered to their surprise that these people really didn't want to join their church. They had their own. And so as a result, the United Church has radically changed its approach, and particularly its new intercultural program emphasizes the fact that we need to understand what culture really means and to work with it. So there's far more interaction now than there used to be with immigrants.
That is fascinating. Thank you for that.
And I think we need to say that this Edmonton Interfaith Centre is here because of people working with refugees in Edmonton. The United Church hired Anne Paladin, who is a Danish woman, and she was working with refugees here in Edmonton. And she was asked to try and gather the immigrant communities into the existing United Churches. And it didn't work.
No.
And the odd person as an immigrant would come to a United Church, but most didn't. They didn't know the songs.
Yeah.
They didn't,
yeah.
know
They didn't
the
feel like they
language,
belonged.
and they didn't feel they belonged. And so she switched. And I was on the committee that worked with her in these early days, 25, 26 years ago. She switched to trying to educate people in the United Church or any Canadian church about the other faiths that are now in Edmonton. And my first experience with Hindus was at Avonmore United Church, where a couple of Hindu people came and a bunch of us gathered, and they told us about their religion. And after 6 years of theology, I knew nothing about them. And so she then suggested that instead of getting people into our own United Churches, that we start forming an interfaith centre, which we did in 1995, and the incorporation came in March of 1996, so we're celebrating 20 years then.
Right.
But it's always amazed me that when we have our Interfaith Centre board meetings, we sit around these same tables here, because our office is across the hall, and I never stop to say, well, or think even, he said that because he's Hindu, or she said that because she's Muslim, or something. That doesn't ever enter into my mind, because we're part of the same organization. We're working together for the same goals of serving
It's that
God.
underlying thing that's guiding you, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I have to say that's what I love about the Mennonite Centre for Newcomers. There's this underlying universal values that's guiding our work, and we're because we're connected to a faith tradition, we're not shy to share those, and the people from other faiths latch onto that and really feel very at home in that. So they're not dogmatic. They're universal values that are guiding our
The
work.
rule is not to proselytize,
That's right.
but to share.
That's right.
Or dialogue.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we have 16 or 17 different faith groups within the
Yeah.
Interfaith
Yeah.
Centre. And I don't think anybody really knows, because our membership form does not ask,
Right.
what is your faith group?
You come as a human.
Anybody comes as a human,
That's right.
and if they feel that they can belong to this organization, they're welcome.
Yeah. Well, that's wonderful.
That's a little sales pitch for
No
All
process.
right.
Yeah, these brochures tell you a little bit more.
I'll have to read that, yeah, for sure.
Now, are there any other questions we've got about?
Yeah, I have to leave on the early side of one.
I heard a presentation at the university, and I think it's the director of the Mennonite Centre was there, and he said that he felt absolutely overwhelmed and was keeping him awake at night, because all of these people had offered to help, but you didn't have, or he said, we didn't have the, you know, the people, the organization to get those people connected. Is that still the situation?
To some degree it is. I mean, people helping by sponsoring is one thing. That's all happening. I meet with groups that are interested. I've developed a little document called 5 Phases of Settlement so they know what they're getting into. That all is working out okay. The more challenging thing in our current culture is the connecting of people. And that's because of fear of liability, if I can be honest. So people want to get to know Syrians, and to do that, I mean, we have only so many volunteer positions that can be effective. We can't just take everybody in. And, I mean, it's not good for anybody, right? It has to be a meaningful connection. And the other interesting thing was everybody called in response to these Paris attacks. Well, nobody was coming yet then. Right? So they called, they had places to some of them said, we'll put people up, you know, we have extra rooms, all this stuff that we can't really use in our current, we could in the Vietnamese, when the Vietnamese came, we could do that, but we can't do that now.
Because of liability?
Yeah. So landlords or people that had a condo, some of them offered reduced rent or even free for a year. We had one guy who offered 2 duplexes, so the 4 units for free for a year, furnished. That was his response to, and he told me, he put it on Facebook, and he wasn't going to furnish it, but people came and said, well, I want to furnish it. so there have been some really successful projects like that, but in general, we're not set up quite as easily as we'd like to be to really take the human contribution. Financial contribution, no problem. Donations, we solved that. We figured that out. But the human contribution is a harder one to manage.
Yes.
On behalf of the group, we'd really like to thank you. This has been most interesting, and I think everybody has learned an awful lot about the programs that are existing and so on. And on behalf of the Interfaith Centre, there's a multi-faith calendar, and that has a calendar with the special dates of, I think it's about a dozen different faith groups.
Wonderful.
Not, of course, all Christian.
Oh, and you have the Lunar New Year, good. Here's the monkey. That's Happy New Year, everybody.
So, we thank you very much, and we appreciate your coming to Salem.
Thank you.